League Classic is something players keep asking for, but the real question isn't whether it should exist, it's whether it would actually hold up today. Whenever this topic comes up, it usually comes from a place of nostalgia. Players look back at older version of League of Legends and imagine a simpler, more enjoyable time. A version of the game where things felt more clear, where champions were easier to understand, and where the experience wasn't overloaded with systems, mechanics, and constant updates. Nostalgia is rarely an accurate replay of the past. It's a reconstruction, and like most reconstructions, it's selective. A few years pass, and people naturally begin to forget the frustrating parts of older game versions. That's not unique to League. It happens in almost every long-running live service game. Players tend to remember the highlights, the exciting matches, the moments of discovery, the feeling of learning something new, or pulling off something unexpected. What gets lost over time are the less glamorous parts. The balance issues, the lack of clarity, the outdated systems, and the long stretches where the game felt unfair or even exhausting. That's how nostalgia works. It doesn't lie, but it filters. It sharpens the good memories and softens the bad ones until the past feels more coherent, more enjoyable, and more pure than it actually was. Most of the demand for League Classic comes from this emotional reconstruction. Players aren't just asking for an older patch, they are asking for a feeling. A slower, simpler version of the game where individual mistakes were more readable, where champions had clearer identities, and where the pace of gameplay didn't feel like it was constantly escalating. A lot of players also associate early League with a more pure competitive experience. This usually refers to a time before mobility, before complex item interactions, and before the game became heavily shaped by layered systems like modern rules, objective cycles, and highly optimized macro patterns. But to understand what a League Classic would actually work today, you first have to understand what all League really was. In its earliest form, League of Legends had a dramatically smaller roster. Around 40 champions defined the entire game. That alone changes everything. When the roster is that small, learning the game is fundamentally different. You don't just learn your role, you learn almost every matchup in the game through repetition. Champion identity is easier to grasp because there are fewer variables competing for your attention. Compare that to today, where the game has, over 170 champions alongside constant reworks, mid-scope updates, item changes, rune system adjustments, and new mechanics being introduced regularly. Even for dedicated players, simply keeping up with the state of the game can feel like a full-time task. This has a major impact on how players experience learning and mastery. In early League, knowledge spreads slowly. Most players didn't have instant access to optimized builds or matchup guides. Information existed, but it was fragmented across forums, early YouTube channels, and word-of-mouth discussions. Because of that, players were constantly experimenting. Not because it was optimal, but because it was necessary. Today, that environment no longer exists in the same way. The moment a new build becomes viable, it is immediately analyzed, recorded, and distributed across multiple platforms. Within hours, it can become a standard knowledge. Tier lists, spreadsheets, coaching breakdowns, and statistical websites ensure that very little in the game remains undiscovered for long. That changes the fundamental nature of progression. Part of what made Old League feel so special wasn't just mechanical design, it was the shared uncertainty. Everyone was learning together. The game hadn't been solved yet. Even basic concepts like optimal jungle routes, wave management efficiency, or team composition theory were still evolving. If League Classic were released today, that sense of discovery would likely vanish almost immediately. Within a week, the same ecosystem of optimization would form again. Tier lists, matchup tables, jungle petting guides, botlane synergy breakdowns, and thousands of hours of analysis content. The game itself might be older, but the player base would not be. This is especially visible when examining the jungle role. The jungle in early League was significantly more chaotic and less structured than it is today. Camp timers were not clearly displayed, spawn patterns were less standardized, and overall efficiency was far less optimized. Junglers often had to rely on intuition, experience, and manual tracking of enemy movements rather than precise in-game information. Laners frequently adjusted their behavior around the jungle in ways that are less common today. Early leashing was a standard expectation. Buff sharing, particularly giving blue buff to mid laners, could directly influence the lane outcome. Early game aggression was far more volatile, with level 2 gank strategies and early mids being central part of competitive and rank play. In that environment, jungle performance could create massive skill gaps. A strong jungler didn't just support their team, they could dominate the map independently and consistently tilted the game in their favor. The idea of 1v9 carry potential wasn't just a commodity phrase, it was genuine gameplay reality in many matches. Modern League has significantly reduced that level of variance. Jungle paths are more standardized, objectives are more structured, and information is far more accessible. This creates a more balanced experience, but also reduces some of the chaotic creativity that defined early gameplay. That said, none of this automatically means Classic would succeed. A useful comparison is World of Warcraft Classic. That game works because it offers a fundamentally different pacing experience rooted in a genre. MMORPGs are built around long-term progression, social systems, and slower gameplay loops. Bringing back an older version of that structure changes the entire experience in a meaningful way. League of Legends is different. It is a highly competitive, highly optimized MOBA where players' behavior rapidly converges towards efficiency. Even if you reverted the game to an older patch, modern players would still approach it with modern knowledge. The meta would form again quickly, and the solved nature of the game would reappear. In other words, you cannot recreate ignorance through design alone. However, that doesn't mean nothing has changed over time. The structure of League has evolved in meaningful ways, even if the core remains recognizable. The fundamental setup, top lane, jungle, mid lane, ADC and support, has stayed consistent for years. This structure defines the game as its core, even as the roles within it have shifted. What has changed is how those roles function and interact with each other. Champion identity is one of the most noticeable differences. When you saw a champion in the loading screen, you generally knew what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to function. Modern champions, by contrast, often feature hybrid identities and flexible roles. Many can be played in multiple positions or adapted to different builds depending on balance patches and team compositions. Champions like Senna are a clear example of this design philosophy shift, functioning as both support and carry depending on context. This flexibility increases strategic depth but also increases complexity for newer or returning players. Another major difference is game pace. Other leagues tended to have slower overall pacing. Team fights were often longer and less explosive. Objectives were less frequent and less centralized, meaning players had more downtime between major decisions. This created more space for thought, positioning, and gradual map development. Even information tracking was more manual. Players had to actively count jungle camps, estimate respawn timers, and remember objective timing without modern UI clarity. Today, much of that cognitive load has been reduced through quality of life improvements and interface enhancements. For some players, that slower, less structured version of the game would feel refreshing. It offers more breathing room, fewer forced engagements, and potentially more opportunities for creative decision-making, especially in jungle-focused macro play and early game pressure. But it is important not to romanticize it without acknowledging its flaws. Odd League was not just slower, it was also significantly rougher. Balance was far less stable. Certain champions could remain overpowered for extended periods simply because the meta was slower to adapt and information was less widely distributed. Broken strategies could exist for longer without being widely countered or understood. Today, even niche strategies are quickly analyzed through data aggression and widely shared optimization content. Win rates, pick rates, and counter strategies are tracked across multiple platforms almost instantly. leaving far less room for long-term hidden dominance. There were also major quality of life gaps that would feel unacceptable today. Visual clarity was weaker, objective tracking was limited, and gameplay readability suffered heavily in chaotic situations. Important information that is now displayed automatically had to be tracked manually or inferred through experience, and some mechanics were genuinely frustrating by modern standards. Or champions like Mordecai are often referenced in this context, particularly due to mechanics that created unpredictable or heavily punishing interactions. These kinds of systems were part of the game's identity at the time, but they would likely be controversial or heavily reworked if reintroduced today. Irony is that many of the improvements players now consider essential were introduced precisely because the community originally complained about these older systems. I think the biggest question isn't whether League Classic would be fun. I think it absolutely would be fun for a while. The launch would probably be incredible. Millions of players would come back to relive old memories, content creators would flood YouTube with nostalgic videos, and streams would be filled with players rediscovering champions, items, and mechanics they haven't seen in years. For a brief moment, it would feel like everyone was experiencing World League together again. Eventually, the excitement would fade, and reality would start to settle in. Players would remember that the old league wasn't just slower, it was also much rougher. Balance was inconsistent, quality of life features were almost non-existent compared to today, and many mechanics that were accepted back then would probably feel frustrating now. It's easy to remember the great moments, but much harder to remember the reasons why I spent years changing the game in the first place. There is also another problem that no version of League Classic can solve. The game may be old, but the players aren't. Back then, everyone was learning together, the game wasn't solved. People experimented because nobody really knew what the best champions, build, or strategies were. Every match felt like an opportunity to discover something new. That simply wouldn't happen today. Within days, players would have optimal jungle pass, champion tier lists, matchup spreadsheets, and guides covering every role. Websites would track win rates, content creators would upload most broken champion videos, and the meta would quickly settle into something familiar. The Classic would still be the old game, but it would be played with a modern mindset. And I think that's the biggest difference. When people say they miss Old League, I don't think they are only talking about the map, the items, or the champion roster. I think what many players really miss is the feeling of discovering the game for the very first time. You can't patch that back into the game. You can recreate all champions, you could recreate old items, old mechanics, and even old bugs if you really wanted to. You can't recreate a community that has no idea what's coming next. That moment only happens once, and I think that's what nostalgia is really holding on to. Does that mean Riot shouldn't make League Classic? Not at all. I actually think it would be a fantastic experience. It would give veteran players a chance to revisit an important part of League history while showing newer players just how much the game has evolved over the years. Even if people only played it for a few weeks, that wouldn't necessarily make it a failure. Sometimes revisiting the past is enough to remind us why we loved it in the first place. Because in the end, the biggest question isn't whether League Classic will be fun. I think it absolutely will be, and I think it will be. The real question is whether people would still be playing it months later once the nostalgia wears off and the reality of the game starts setting in. Because wanting to revisit an old game and wanting to live in it permanently are two very different things.